The honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I had the opportunity to ask the Minister of Transport directly about the withdrawal of Greyhound from Western Canada. The Minister made time to appear before the Transport Committee, and I was grateful to have had the chance to tell him in person about how serious the lack of safe, affordable transportation is in Saskatchewan. And Mr. Speaker, while the Minister was gracious in giving his time to the members at the Transportation Committee, unfortunately, many questions still remain, including my question in the House of last September to the lone Saskatchewan Minister. Since the shutdown of STC, many women fleeing domestic violence have had to hitchhike or turn to Kijiji to get a ride to a shelter. It is unconscionable for a feminist government to know this and do nothing. Last January, the Minister of Innovation told this House that this government would work with me to look for meaningful solutions to this crisis. To this day, I've heard absolutely nothing. So I suggested I ask the lone Saskatchewan Minister this time, what would he do to ensure people in Saskatchewan have safe, reliable public transportation? The answer I received that day was from the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities, who said that this government would always be there for the people of Saskatchewan and that there would be good news coming. He also said I could come and see me or the Minister of Public Safety and my colleagues. Mr. Speaker, I've reached out to the Minister as well as the lone Minister from Saskatchewan to no avail. To date, I have not heard anything back from either Minister, which leads me to believe that this government is very good at talking a good line, but when it comes to delivering on solutions, not so much. Take, for example, the recent announcement in response to Greyhound's withdrawal. For a full year after the cancellation of STC, the government did nothing. It took the withdrawal of a private company for them to actually take notice of the growing transportation crisis in Western Canada. Fortunately for British Columbia and Alberta, those provinces have progressive NDP governments who have already stepped up to mitigate the serious gaps in public transportation in their respective provinces. Unfortunately for my province, Saskatchewan's provincial government decided to shut down STC, and the silence from the Saskatchewan Conservative MPs on this issue is deafening. It's unfortunate that when it came to standing up for safe, affordable transportation, it does appear that politics trump the needs of communities and constituents. And have we actually heard anything from the Minister of Public Safety, who's from Saskatchewan? Sadly, no, Mr. Speaker. The safety of women and children fleeing domestic violence must be made a priority by the Minister of Public Safety. People in my province relied on STC to get them to medical appointments, to work, to school, to run their businesses, and to connect them to friends and family in other parts of the province and Canada. People in northern and rural and remote areas especially need this safe, affordable mode of transportation. Surely, Mr. Speaker, there is a role for the federal government's leadership and real investment when such a serious gap exists. Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member opposite for her question. I also want to assure her that in the Minister of Public Safety and in the Minister of Infrastructure, there are two very prominent advocates for the needs of Saskatchewan when it comes to infrastructure and for all of the other causes that she referred to in her question. Indeed, the Government of Canada recognizes the importance of high-quality, safe, accessible and reliable public transit. That's why we have invested over $180 billion in our Investing in Canada plan. Public transit brings communities together. It provides residents with better access to services while reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
We've worked very closely with the provinces and territories to develop and implement our plan.
We understand that transit plays an important role in the lives of Canadians. That's why we're making unprecedented investments of more than $28 billion to support public transit across the country. In
Saskatchewan, communities use federal funding to support the projects that best meet their needs.
Our funding under Phase 1 of the plan has helped support projects like the renewal of Saskatoon's vehicle fleet, the replacement of 17 buses and 9 paratransit buses in Regina, and upgrades to the public transit fleet in Prince Albert. Moose Jaw and Saskatoon have used funding to improve their own systems and address their most pressing transit needs. And it is important to note that the decision to terminate the services referred to by my honourable colleague across the way, provided by the STC, was made by the province of Saskatchewan. The STC is a provincially run service, and it is up to the provinces to decide how best to provide public transit services to their communities within their jurisdictions. The Government of Canada and the province of Saskatchewan have worked closely to finalize and sign the integrated bilateral agreement on October 17, 2018, and indeed, this is something that we should celebrate, Mr. Speaker. The agreement will provide long-term infrastructure funding for public transit under the next phase of our plan. Saskatchewan and its communities can also pursue public transit projects through the Canada Infrastructure Bank. The bank was established to help provide even more infrastructure, and with $5 billion set aside for public transit, is currently open to receiving proposals and engaging with stakeholders. Le gouvernement de Canada fait
The Government of Canada is making unprecedented investments in infrastructure for communities.
to work with the Government of Saskatchewan and all of our provincial partners to make strategic, informative investments that will build 21st century communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for outlining all the ways in which the federal government has partnered around public transportation in cities and larger communities in Saskatchewan. My question was about the fact that there is no intercity bus service in Saskatchewan anymore, and that the Greyhound pulling out reduced that even more, and that I was asking that the federal government, and they've stated that they do have a role in investing in that. Otherwise, if your provincial government says you don't need a provincial bus service and the federal government says it's not our responsibility, that means you are leaving many people in Saskatchewan high and dry, and many people who are vulnerable, especially in rural and remote communities. So I'm asking for the government to step up and provide that leadership and to give us more details, which we didn't get from the transportation minister at the committee last week. And so I'm asking for the government, the federal government, who can play a role in this area. It's not just a provincial government responsibility. So that's my question. Thank you, Mr.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And just to pick up on my honourable colleague's final remarks, of course, the Government of Canada has an important and significant role to play when it comes to infrastructure. Our commitment to infrastructure is reflected in the historic investments that I referred to when it comes to public transit, and indeed that includes existing transit fleets, $29 million for Saskatchewan when it comes to repairing and rehabilitating their local public transit systems. And I just want to conclude by emphasizing to her that this is a government that respects local decision makers. We listen carefully to cities and municipalities, and we have also set aside additional funds for rural and northern communities, including her riding, and we will continue to work with her and all parties to get infrastructure done. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.